Thank you, ARM, for this warm welcome and for hosting us here in this beautiful place again. It is a remarkable year, pivotal year for cell and gene therapy, and having been fortunate enough to attend this conference many years now in a row, it is a distinctly different energy in the room and here in this setting than in prior years. A lot is at stake, and both the opportunities and the challenges have ratcheted. And so we're here today to talk about commercialization, and what that really means is bringing these remarkable technologies into mainstream medicine and extending access to patients. Our company, Vineti, provides a digital platform that connects and orchestrates the cell and gene therapy process. So it is a distinct honor to connect some remarkable panelists here to the audience here today. So with that, I'd like to invite our panelists to join me on the stage. We've got Bob Azelby, who's the Chief Commercial Officer at Juno. I'm just going to keep calling it like a beauty pageant. We're just going to keep the contestants coming here. Nick Colangelo, who is the President and CEO at Vericel. We've got Pascal Touchon, who is the SVP and Global Head of Cell and Gene Therapies at Novartis, and Jeffrey Walsh, who's our the Chief Financial and Strategy Officer at Bluebird Bio. So I'm going to take a seat next to you guys. So my first question is actually for the audience. So who here in this room has already commercialized a cell therapy? Would you raise your hand? Okay. So there's a lot to learn here. I think we have one member of our panelists. Two. Yes, well, two. That's true. So two here to. So I think it's really interesting to me that in our preparatory calls, we talked about the definition of commercialization, and there was some nuance among these panelists. So I think for our first question, I'd love to just ask each of you to talk through what commercialization means to you and your organization. So, Jeff, would you just kick us off, please?
Sure, happy to. I may be a little bit slow this morning, and I blame that on the Yankees, a victory last night, and Bob Preddy, wherever he is. We had a couple of celebratory drinks after the Yankee win, but excited to be here today, first and foremost, and it's crazy fun to see the energy and the momentum in the field, and we were talking a lot about that yesterday. We obviously have a number of companies either recently commercialized or on the verge of commercialization, and for us, we talk a lot about this because we don't just have CAR T therapies that are a little bit earlier in our pipeline, but also have some severe genetic disease targeted therapies that are approaching, knock on wood, some commercialization and filing and then commercialization milestones. But to us, it's all about the patient experience. And I wrote down a phrase that I think really, for us, captures it, which is patient access and experience. And it's all anchored in the patient first and foremost, because if they don't have a good experience, and that's the COE model, it's access, literally getting access to the therapy. So that's the experience part. If they don't have a good experience out the gates, that's going to be a problem, not just for our therapies, but everybody else. And the other part to that is the access piece, the experience and the access, and that really is about something I suspect we're going to get into, which is some of the reimbursement challenges that are in front of us, and some of the novel things that are being put out there by companies that are leading the way. So patient center, focus. Yep.
Pascal.
Yeah, I'll come back to the patient as well, because for us it really started just 5 years ago with Emily. And for this started at UPenn, and I would like to thank the people at UPenn that did that work. That was a great work they did there, Carl June and Stephen Grupp in particular. And the first patient treated was really what started the ball rolling for us. And then when we heard about that, we started to connect with UPenn, we established that collaboration, and just in 5 years, we've been able to move that to regulatory approval in the US. That's a great adventure, very complex, very challenging one, but we're very pleased now because for us, commercialization means patient access. And we've treated already 250 patients with Novartis-made cells across different indications and studies, but now we're really treating the patient that can access the drug in the US and hopefully soon in many other geographies, and we can bring that therapy to many, many patients around the world. So commercialization is really around that, around the end of the first part of the journey in terms of development and changes, and the start of another part of the journey full of changes as well, but more importantly, give patient access.
So I'll echo that. Obviously, you know, we have therapies that dramatically improve patients' lives, and it's a wonderful thing. And we have an intimate relationship with our patients as an autologous cell therapy provider. And so it's a wonderful privilege to be able to do that. We happen to have a couple of products already commercialized. Macy, which is a product to repair cartilage defects, and then Epicel, which is a permanent skin replacement for severe burn patients. And we also had the first advanced therapy medicinal product approved, tissue engineered product approved in Europe. So we live commercialization every day, and it's been a really interesting experience. And we kind of jumped in head first. So back in 2014, we acquired from Sanofi what was Genzyme's cell therapy and regenerative medicine business. So we went from a 35-person mid-stage development company straight into commercialization. And that, you know, I was kidding with Bob. He's had a few years to plan to get to commercialization. We jumped head in. But it's been wonderful, and it's great to be, again, able to really focus on our patients and how we improve their lives. And, you know, we'll talk a lot about the issues that we faced. We have premium priced products. You know, we live the market access, reimbursement kinds of issues. How do you get autologous cell therapies widely dispersed to patients around the country and around the world? So happy to have the opportunity to share our experiences.
Great.
And then I'll take a slightly different approach. First of all, Pascal, congratulations. I mean, it's just breaking through with the first approval is just fantastic for the industry. From a commercialization perspective, obviously what the three gentlemen on the panel stated is clearly patient focused. But I think when I think about the term commercialization, it goes back into the development side of things and making sure you're designing your trials, putting them in the right sites of care, making sure you have the right endpoints, and whether it's to be securing a particular line of therapy or reimbursement in a particular setting, all those elements starts really early on. So if you can plan earlier, then when you actually end up getting the market, life becomes a little bit easier, so you're not trying to close the gaps on things that you may have missed.
Great. So we'll get into some more of the detail on a number of these comments. But I think sort of the elephant in the room, of course, is pricing and reimbursement. I know there's quite a bit of chatter in the market about this, and I think I would love to, and obviously Pascal, Novartis is taking the lead on outcomes-based pricing and what that means to the industry. So I'm just curious, again, from each of your vantage points, what are some of the novel ways in which we can protect? These are significant COGS, and really phenomenal efficacy that we're seeing. But these are also very expensive price points. So I'd love to hear some of the thought process. I know Pascal, again, Novartis has taken a leading position on this front. So I know there's lots of interest in hearing your commentary. But everyone here on this panel has been thinking a lot about this issue. So I'd love to run down, maybe Pascal, if you could kick us off, please, with
No, thank you. I think first of all, I mean, it's not that new for Novartis. I mean, outcome-based pricing and outcome-based approach has been around for a few years now. I think our CEO has been very keen to try to work with various insurers, payers, organizations to try to move away from just drug pricing into something different that could take into account how we could play a role in managing the inefficiency of the system there. So we've done outcome-based pricing for Entresto in heart failure, for Tasigna in CML. I mean, we even in Tasigna in CML did studies to show that you can stop treatment for a while and without any consequences for the patient, which I think is unheard of. I don't know many drug companies that have decided to do a study to show you can stop treatment. And that is good enough for the patients, and then you can resume treatment if there is a need at a later stage. So when we came to Kymriah, we thought from the beginning that we had to be innovative, not only in bringing this transformative therapy to the patients, which includes a lot of challenges in general, but also how can we ensure patient access. And when you have this type of one-off therapy that is really having a very profound, deep, durable remission rate on many, many patients, majority of patients. I mean, the Diana studies led to an 83% remission rate at 3 months, And that's quite amazing when you see that this remission rate is not only very high, is durable and maintained and sustained. So when thinking about that, we decided, especially within the very complex US system, to find ways to play a role in access for patients, as well as in trying to clarify the value for that therapy, value for the patient, value for the medical environment, value for the society, and value for the healthcare system as well. So that's why we went into these discussions with CMS in particular, and other payers as well, to try to see how can we work together. And there were two aspects that we worked with CMS. One is around the idea of indication-based pricing, which allows, and that's something that we believe is extremely important, to clarify what's the value of a particular therapy in a particular indication based on clinical results that are being achieved. So indication-based pricing is, we believe, one of the way forward for the industry to be able to bring more value to the system. The other aspect was an outcome-based approach, and of course, depending on the disease, depending on the therapy, you need to agree and align on what these outcome, what the outcome that the different different stakeholders wants to achieve: the patient, the doctors, the system, and the therapy provider. But here, in the case of Kymriah, in pediatric ALL and young adult ALL, we have a very clear outcome that is fully accepted as very clear by the different stakeholders around remission. So we discussed the possibility to have, alongside this outcome-based approach, as I said, is more global at Novartis, is to make it more specific to Kymriah and to the treatment of pediatric and young adult ALL. And we went into that idea that since we have this very high level of response, that the idea that, and very early response, the idea that if the patient does not respond after 1 month, we will not charge for the therapy. That's very specific to Kymriah, that's very specific to pediatric and young adult ALL, and every therapy, every disease, every indication will lead to a different type of approach. But the idea is the same, which is how can we align with different stakeholders of what's the outcome we try to reach, and how we can commit ourselves to reaching that outcome.
Where have you been feeling the most resistance for this strategy?
The most resistant is that the system is not organized for such. So by definition, when you ask for the first time whether we could do that, the answer is no.
Right.
So that's the starting point.
Good
is a no.
ground, yeah.
Then you have to work.
Is it back to infrastructure? Jeff?
So the concept of indication-based pricing is something that we really didn't have to think about because, I mean, in the case of the CAR-T, you're obviously potentially going after multiple different indications. For bluebird, anchored in CALD and thalassemia and sickle cell, it's always been about ultimately putting together a value story that allows for a dialogue. So initially, it's just a dialogue whether there's an interest in these type of therapies. And for some indications, to your point, it may be viable and interesting, and some it may not. And really, we're talking about these type of pay-for-performance type arrangements. And I think we've learned through lots of conversations with HTA bodies and payers, in particular in Europe, that it has to be not only indication-specific, but almost payer-specific, and certainly country-specific. We're not as deep into the U.S. conversations, obviously, as you guys are, but we are probably deeper into not negotiations, but understanding the fail points in a system for these type of therapies. And I think that's the first thing, is really deeply understanding the potential fail points, whether that be funding flows or what have you. And then from there, obviously, building the value story for those ultimate negotiations. I think the last piece of this is a big commitment that we all, I think, have to make to following those patients post-fact. And this is commitments to real-world evidence, strategies and plans, as well as some pretty significant investment in registries, if we want to get there. And especially if we want to go beyond really short-term outcomes, whatever that is, but longer-term outcomes, and truly going at risk with payers for the benefit ultimately of the system. it's going to take a lot of deep understanding first and foremost, and years of discussions with payers to get to the right point. And then policy change. I mean, we're going to have significant policy change. I think that's one of the things that ARM is really focused on, which is great, is supporting this network of companies to affect policy.
Yeah, that and the standardization effort. I mean, I think the load, in addition to the pipeline development and the orchestration around actually delivering, it's a tremendous amount of effort and time and energy to actually have these individual negotiations that are specific to geographies. I think this is where a standard-setting body at ARM can make a real difference in this industry, because it needs to be a shared workload. It's too at this point it's too disconnected, and the burden is disproportionate on the pioneering companies here. Nick.
Well, so, maybe I'm going to take a step back for a minute and just talk about sort of kind of the broader distribution and how these products are managed by plans. And we have a couple different examples. And again, our products fall into the sort of premium priced products. And they're one-time basic treatment. So when we treat a catastrophic burn patient, in order of our skin grafts can be a couple $100,000, but it's a one-time treatment essentially for these patients, and our label indicates 87 to 90% survival rates for patients once they're treated. So clearly it's a product that brings a lot of value. I'm assuming that all of these products are going to be from a commercial plan perspective, and for instance, Macy is essentially all military and commercial plan business, so that's sort of the world we spend most of our time thinking about. But unlike traditional prescription drugs that are managed under a pharmacy benefit, the management from a plan's perspective happens at the contracting phase. What tier are you going to be on? What are the co-pays and so on? But once that happens, when a physician writes a script, the patient's going to have access to the product, right? For these therapies, and for ours in particular, and I assume the majority of the cell and gene therapies that we're talking about, they're going to be managed under the medical benefit of a commercial plan. And so what that means is there's going to be a medical policy, which the plans use as a guideline for determining whether a treatment is medically necessary for a given patient, and then you have an authorization. And that's a way that access to these products are managed. That has a lot of implications. First of all, they write medical policies based on clinical evidence, and when it's compelling, obviously, as in our case, and I think in your case as well, that's very helpful, and it shouldn't be a limitation on patients that have access. But it's very interesting because just because the FDA approves a product, that doesn't mean the plans are going to cover it. So you can look at, for instance, Sarepta, approved, accelerated approval based on 12 patients. Most plans will cover it. Some will say, we don't think the clinical evidence is there yet, and we're going to deem it investigational, and they won't reimburse for it potentially. So that's an issue. But once you have the medical policy, then the patient will have access to it, and I think you can head down the sort of the highway in terms of patient gets access, product gets reimbursed. So it's very complicated. It's a manual approval process for each patient. It's not automated like a pharmacy benefit, and that has a lot of implications. Likewise, because they're premium priced products, you have to think about how it will be distributed. So again, we have both models. In the case of Epicel, we sell directly to hospitals. They get reimbursed based on their contracts with plans. In the case of Macy, we distribute through a pharmacy provider, like many specialty biologics. So generally, when a product is administered either in a hospital or a facility setting, or it's a home infusion or home injection product, it will be managed through specialty pharmacy providers. And that, the reason you do that is because they have access to most commercial plans, and it provides a lot of patient access. Of course, there's economic impacts because they get a piece of, the margin, right? So you can do it either way. You can sell directly to hospitals. and they will deal with the reimbursement issues, or you can sell through specialty pharmacy providers. And of course, the other piece of that is case management and hub services. So somebody has to manage the coordination between the patient, the physician office, and the plan. And that's typically outsourced because most manufacturers don't want to be HIPAA-covered entities. And so the complexities, I guess a long way of saying it is, it's not just the pricing and how it gets reimbursed, it's how you're going to distribute it. And that has implications, both in terms of access and how the product's reimbursed.
Great.
And I would just add, I think it may be a watershed event with CMS, because companies like Juno want to understand the details as relates to if it's free goods, does it impact Medicare best price, how would all those particular elements work? And so really getting the rules of the road as we move forward is really, really important. And I think we're at that threshold now where these products are becoming expensive, they're extremely personalized, and it kind of comes together with, pay for performance and getting value for the dollars that you're spending. And so I think CMS made a big step forward with Novartis, and now we'd love to see the details so we can start thinking about, how would you operationalize such an arrangement, not only with Medicare, but how you would do it with commercial payers and how that may or may not impact best price.
Great. So along with the pricing complexities, these supply chains are the most complex in the history of biologics. And so you mentioned the COEs and making sure there's as much alignment and essentially a set of standards around how these therapies are delivered. In addition to the complexity about buy and bill and some of the work, the cash flow issues. I mean, there's just a whole bunch of complexities coming at this on the delivery side. And so just curious about how you're thinking about that in each of your companies in terms of orchestrating, creating a set of expectations among the providers, among patients, just that level of complexity we've never seen before. So how are you blocking and tackling that? And I'm going to start with you, Pascal. We'll kind of switch up the order a bit.
Oh, thank you. It's complex. It's manageable. Just get the right team in the right place to do it. We did that progressively, and I think that was a good thing to do in two different steps. One was to move from one center, UPenn, to treat patients in many centers. So how do you manage that? Then to move from one country, the US, to do studies in multi-countries, different continents. We've done studies now in DLBCL in 27 centers across the world, in pediatric ALL, 25 centers across the world, from Japan, Australia to Canada, Europe, the US. So moving progressively, we learn how to manage this complexity there. Now we're moving into a first country with first approval in a relatively small population. That's also a learning phase about moving to that, treating these few hundred kids that really deserve that one in a life type of therapy there. And then we're moving to other type of therapies where we're going to treat thousands of patients. And then we're going to move to other countries. So it's a progression of the complexity that we've been able to manage so far. We have also, from the beginning, built the idea of being global. So we didn't thought about just trying to be in one or two countries, but thought about being global. We've built, as you know, in our process, a cryopreservation, which we think is the best way for that type of therapy to be able to manage a global supply chain and logistics there. And we see that our friends at Kite now moving to cryopreservation, after having said that this was probably not adapted. Because when you want to go global, how do you manage that? Till there is maybe a day where the manufacturing can occur at the point of care, but we are not yet that day. You need to be able to manage the cells across borders, across geographic zone, time zone, a lot of complexity there, and the cryopreservation was really a great asset there in managing that complexity and that global aspect there.
What are some of the other key gaps, though, in that the uniqueness of a global rollout? What are, again, what Novartis is grappling with now? What are some of the
I think that there are two aspects there, and I'm in discussion with my friend from GSK about Streamvedis in Europe, and the challenge is to have, due to the particularity of the product, only one center where you need to bring the patient to the center in the world, and the challenges that this creates there. The idea here that by definition is this is not a pill. When we launched Glivec now a few years ago, we managed to have stocks of Glivec available across the world very, very fast. Here it's a different situation where these therapies are sophisticated. They are extremely effective, but they also create side effects that are linked, on-target side effects that needs to be well managed. So you need to do that only in well experienced, trained, and certified centers. So that means you cannot go everywhere at the same time. You have to go progressively in centers. So that's what we've learned as well, is how we go progressively to centers and how do we manage, on one hand, the global rollout of centers, but at the same time, how can we manage patient access and have referral? And even in the US today, we have that situation. Not all centers are operational, but we already have referrals going to these centers. So that's the way we're trying to manage in between a very unique case like the Strimvelis case in Europe and a case like Glivec, where it was a pill that you need to make available in many, many places around the world.
Bob.
Yeah, so I think a couple points there. One, I think, is we learn more about these products. We're at the very early stages of the science, and we're going to have to continue to understand, the type of cells that go into the product and how they impact the patient, and how do we improve on the toxicity profile so you can democratize access to these products, because 80% of the patients reside outside of these centers of excellence, right? They're out into the communities. And so I think the science will continue to evolve as we move forward. I think the second element, to go to your question on standardization, I think, in the next year or 2 years, you may have 3, 4, or 5 products in a particular disease. If each of those have different REMS as it relates to how to manage cytokine release syndrome or neurotoxicity, it'll be interesting to see if an academic center or a large oncology clinic, how they will operationalize 2 or 3 of those, and will they just choose one pathway? And then if you're executing a REMS and they're doing things slightly different than the way you agreed with the FDA, I think getting standards on that is going to be critically important.
Yeah, and I guess I would just add, there's 2 aspects to it. Again, we've been working with autologous cell therapies for a couple decades globally. And, at one time, a portion of our company developed software to be able to track, from bone marrow aspiration all the way to surgical delivery in an interventional cardiology center for a development stage product. So it is complex when you're taking a patient's tissues, you're sending it into a manufacturing site. So we do all our own manufacturing and commercialization, and then coordinating with the surgical centers and so on. So, it can be done, but it is very complex. And, one of the complexities from a supply chain standpoint is with autologous cell therapies, every patient is a lot. So whereas in traditional pharmaceuticals and biologics, you go through the manufacturing and release process for a lot that will treat potentially thousands of patients. Here you're doing it every time for every patient lot. So, the quality systems and quality personnel sort of dwarfs even the manufacturing personnel to make these things. So, and again, when you're manufacturing these things, I recall when we purchased this business, I think there were 46 systems that we either had to replicate or migrate, out of Sanofi to be able to run as a standalone GMP manufacturer. So the complexity, half of them have to be validated for GMP manufacturing, et cetera. So the complexity is almost mind-boggling from that standpoint, but obviously doable. In terms of how these products are distributed, we probably have a case study for both. In the case of Epicel, there's roughly 100 burn centers around the country. And, it involves a lot of training, making sure that they know how to administer the product so that they have successful outcomes, because if they don't, they're not going to come back. And these patients, there really are no other treatment options for these catastrophic burn patients. It's autografts, or they can be treated with Epicel. But if a center doesn't have a good experience the first time around, they won't come back. So we need to make sure they're trained, and we spend a lot of time on peer-to-peer training and so on. With MACI, that's a wide, we don't have issues like you do where you have to manage the patients for potential side effects, right? I mean, it's a the magic of MACI is it's a simple and fast procedure for an orthopedic surgeon. So these products can evolve to a place like we're at with MACI, where, again, you take a biopsy, it's sent in, there's the complexity of the manufacturing, but we actually FedEx the finished product out to the surgical sites. It's there the next day, and they administer it. So you can actually get to a point where these products are administered or distributed in a way that allows for widespread distribution anywhere in the country, anywhere in the world. So we treat patients in Europe, fly the biopsy over, manufacture the product, ship it back, and administer. So it can be done.
It's lucky. Okay. Go ahead, Jeff.
Can be done, but this shit is hard.
I didn't say that wasn't the case.
And we're learning certainly this as we think about the preparation, again, hopefully for something in Europe. Typical of Bluebird, we take the hard challenge first, and Europe is certainly not the U.S. is easy by any stretch, but Europe, you've just got different challenges. There are cross-border issues that are real. Where does the patient originate from? Where do they get the cells collected from? Where do they get the transplant from? Where do they return to for follow-up care? And sometimes that may be within country. Sometimes it might not. And the challenge is there. That's why the understanding of funding flows and processes and regulations is critical foundation. And we're certainly in the learning phase of that. And some people are experiencing it real time right now. So anxious to see how things go. But I do want to come back to the patient. It really does have to be a patient-centric process, that everything is around the patient experience. It has to be the provider and the site experience too, certainly agree. For example, in apheresis, standardizing a collection of cells just within our process, never mind across the industry, is important. And making sure that process is a good experience for the patient and for the site. There are just so many questions that you don't have to ask in a standard therapeutic paradigm that you have to ask here. We haven't talked about IT systems and the role of IT systems in this process.
That would be the 46 systems I was
mentioning
earlier.
There we go.
But we have Eddie there.
But the role of IT systems here is significant. The amount of money that companies have to pour into that to be able to manage not just the therapeutic, which has its own complexities of getting, in our case, vector to the right place for the patient at the right time, and then returning, obviously, that therapy to the provider to return to the patient. But also managing the patient through this whole process. They come into the process, they go away, and then they come back in. So it's just an incredibly I think it's the way that we're going to have to deal with the medicine going forward. So we're all trying to pioneer some of this stuff, and we'll make some good decisions and some mistakes along the way. But it is, this shit's hard.
It's interesting that these, again, in the autologous realm, and Nick, you've been out in front further than the CAR-T folks here, but that for the first time in a way, there's been such disintermediation between pharma and patient, and even pharma and provider to some extent. But because of this outcomes-based approach and the monitoring requirements and the intensity of the potential reactions to some of these therapies, you have an opportunity for really arguably the first time to make that connection point. And I think using some of the state-of-the-art IT platforms to do that is a very real opportunity here and now. And to make that part of the standardization, so the expectations among providers, among patients, is that there will be a through line between these manufacturers and the patients they're serving. But if you step back for a moment, that is truly transformational. That doesn't exist. The incentives are not aligned for that to happen in the current healthcare system. So there's a lot of work to do, and I think there's a huge opportunity to take these remarkable efficacies and make them essentially, impact the system so that they're more efficient, and there is that point of connectivity. So I fervently believe in that. I think we're at that point, and I think it's, I think the leverage is significant. So I guess if you each had to say one thing, as we've had there's some overlap in some of these comments, but just if you had to say your number one challenge, and if we essentially here in this community, right, this industry could address one challenge together, whether that's through a standard setting body, through conversations with regulators, with policymakers, et cetera, what's the number one challenge? If you could just start, Bob,
Yeah, I think there's a lot of challenges.
Yeah,
and so,
it's hard to choose.
If you talk about number one, I think these products are so game-changing.
Yep.
And their efficacy is so enormous. Is how do we really focus on getting as many patients access to these products as possible? And that's not only figuring out how to take the product to the patient, but it also requires how do you scale from a manufacturing perspective and a capacity perspective to really impact as many folks as you can, not only in the U.S. or Europe, but around the globe. And so I think that will be a monumental task.
So I think we probably, from a commercial standpoint, spend most of our time thinking about how do we make the patient experience the best it can be, and the physician or surgeon experience. And we know our products work, whether it's Epicel and a 90% survival rate or a 90% response rate for patients who are treated with MACI. We know our products work and that our patients will have a good experience from that standpoint. But because, again, these therapeutics are managed under medical benefits, really making it smooth. The surgeon's office does not want to spend all day trying to figure out how the plan is going to give them a medical authorization for their patient, right? And the patient doesn't want to wait to have a surgery until 3 weeks worth of sort of medical policy review, benefits verification, and all that stuff occurs. So for us, it's all about getting the right case management team together who can connect all the parties and get things approved as quickly as possible, so that, again, the surgeon doesn't have, and his office or her office don't have to spend time on that, and the patients are able to be treated when they want to be treated and need to be treated.
I think for me, come back to the patient access. In the US, we have now, especially for the Kymriah first indication, a real good system of access. So we see patients flowing in the right way. But ex-US, that's what keeps me awake at night, because I know there are kids out there that we need to find a way to treat them. And how can we accelerate our global platform of activities, how we can manage access for these kids. I think that's what is my main challenge right now.
And just to piggyback on that for a moment, I mean, if you look back, as I mentioned, MACI was the first tissue-engineered advanced therapy medicinal product approved in Europe. And if you look at the ATMP products that have been approved over the last 5 years, maybe one is still being commercialized in Europe. There's been a number of them, including MACI. When we purchased the business, we suspended manufacturing in Europe. The market certainly has challenges, not only because it's always more difficult to get reimbursed in Europe, but because there were things like hospital exemptions that were referenced earlier that just ruined it, and people pulled back. Now we're taking a different approach. We're actually looking to go back into Europe, and as long as we can manufacture here in the US and kind of address the other hurdles that other manufacturers have to address, we plan to be back into Europe, but it won't be a widespread effort. It will be centers of excellence in certain countries where hospital exemptions have essentially ruined the marketplace.
Yeah.
So I would say that we've been talking a lot about the challenges associated with getting these therapies commercialized. I think taking a step back, there are a lot of amazing things happening right now, which we all know. The data are incredible across the board. And that allows us to have this conversation about addressing these challenges. So that's the anchor. The regulatory environment seems to be very favorable, not just in the US, but in Europe. And we've all had conversations with the agencies that are very collegial, partly because of the data and the drive to bring these truly transformative therapies to market. The COE models and some of the challenges we're talking, we'll figure those out. It's about investment, a little bit of trial and error, and we'll get there. So there's anxiety there, but we'll figure it out. And actually, we're setting the stage for the future of the industry to some degree in terms of how you deliver therapies to patients. To me, the biggest challenge is along the lines of patient access, but it's enabling value-based pricing. And that's enabling from a government perspective, from a payer perspective, and it's also from the industry perspective that we're pushing hard enough and not just giving up at no. Can't do that. Well, why? And how can we do that as opposed to no, we can't do that? We will get there if we keep asking those questions. We keep pushing doors open that today are not open to us. And big believer in that. And we've seen some of that, again, not in negotiation per se, but in talking about different types of models. The initial response is we can't do that today. But there are ways. There are absolutely ways to do it. And I think your engagement with CMS is one example of that, of really pushing the envelope. We have to keep pushing and pushing and pushing. So, and that's ARM's role in this. It's industry's role in this. And and that engagement, I think, is going to be critical. But that's the one thing I'm probably we are most focused on and worried about is enabling that type of a dialogue and that type of relationship.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for pointing out the opportunities as well. You anticipated my last question before I get to invite the audience to ask their own. I think that what this rollout means, because we are, Nick, your therapies have been out, but in terms of CAR T, we're at the advent of this new market. What does this mean? What does this focus mean for the emerging science and the pipeline? We heard a lot about the investment stats. It's remarkable. The data is incredible. What does it mean for the investment that's happening in the pipeline and from your vantage point, this excitement about this is just the tip of the iceberg. This is the beginning. I want to, before we open it up, just have again, this is intended to be more of a positive, hey, this is really just take stock of where we are in the opportunity, and any commentary before we hear from the audience. So anyone like to jump in?
Yeah, I'll
Please.
start. I think, being at Juno now almost 2 years, and I think about when I started in November 2015 and what we know to what we know now, a couple years later from a scientific perspective is enormous. Just the insights that we're having on the type of cells and how they operate, which cells and what combination of cells. I think we're only at the beginning here, and as the science and the investment flows in, I think the impact for patients will be enormous. Not only you have great data in PEDS, but 50% of kids are benefiting, right? Mm-hmm. You can talk similar ranges in diffuse large B cell. We're going to understand why folks are benefiting and why they're not, and there's going to be opportunities to adjust these products or use them in combination to maybe take a 50% complete response rate to an 80% complete response rate. And I think we are at the very early stages here, and I think investment's going to continue to flow because the efficacy and the impact you're seeing on patients is enormous.
I agree with Bob, except that it's 83% complete response and 50. But that's another debate. We'll have that on the show. Now, what I think is going to happen is more partnership. And I think at all levels, it's so complex to treat the patients that nobody can do it on its own. Mm-hmm. So it's mean partnership. If I look at the patient level, with the patients, with the family of the patient in some cases, with the hospital, the institutions, doctors, with the payers, and then all the system and the process, all what we need to improve the process from manufacturing to the chain of identity and the way to have the right interface with the patients and the institutions, but also in terms of finding new targets, new constructs, new ways to improve that. It's just the beginning. Mm-hmm. And we have so many things to do together. And certainly for Novartis, for us, we would like to increase our level of partnerships in this field and be able to work with many of you in terms of improving that, because it's just the beginning, and that's good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's a couple aspects. So we talked about sort of on an individual product basis reimbursement, appropriate pricing, and so on. But again, I think we'll see an evolution one way as a wave of new therapies comes, not just the first ones where it's more manageable, smaller populations, et cetera. But one of the ways that plans manage these things is, for instance, they might say, we'll reimburse, but the facility has to bill us. So we have plans for our products that do that. Blue Cross Blue Shield will say, hey, the facility has to bill us. What that means is the facility has to buy the product. Now, if you've got a big cancer center who's treating 1,000 patients, do you think they're going to lay out $500 million, right? $500,000 times 1,000 patients. And so what's that going to mean about how this field evolves as all the therapies come down the pike? And then I envision in probably 5 years we'll be up here talking about the things that we live with, which is great. One of our goals was to take a business that was sort of declining in the hands of Sanofi, mostly because it was a different model, autologous cell therapy in a big pharma. That's a bit of a stretch. So, our goal has always been to demonstrate that we can...
I'm glad you said that, I didn't.
But just to demonstrate that you can build a successful business, especially with cell therapies and autologous cell therapies. And, so what do I spend my time on? We're judged by Wall Street on how our commercial business is performing. So we're compared to other med tech companies. Luckily, we happen to be in the high growth segment. Revenues were up 32% last quarter. But so we're, back in the old, how you doing? Okay, now we can get products to market. We know it. We know the profound impact it can have on patients. Now we'll be judged as commercial organizations, and are you performing like other segments of the industry, which is fun.
Jeff?
I would say that most excited about a phase of the industry we're about to go into, which is disclosing or hearing more about individual patient stories. I think that is going to be incredibly powerful for the field, and you certainly have one story that was anchored in your therapy early on. And the power of those type of stories continuing to come out. They haven't been able to come out because they're in clinical trials, and there's obviously constraints there. But increasingly, as we move more into a commercial world where patients are going to be more visible in terms of their outcomes. Now, there's the downside of that too, which we have to be very careful of, which is any negative stories that come out about it. But I think the data are so strong across the field that those stories are going to carry us forward. And I think that's the hope. It's patient by patient, whether it be an oncology patient or a rare disease patient. Those are the stories I think that we all anchor us all day in and day out as to why we're here. And so that's what's going to carry us forward. That's what's going to continue to have the funding flow to allow us to continue to invest in the things we're talking about that'll work itself out over time. So.
Great, thank you. Okay, it's time for our audience to ask questions. Fire away. Please, who would like to ask the first questions? I think there's some folks with
Are you ready?
microphones. Yeah.
Okay, this is an innovative product. Dave Ferret, Sigilon Therapeutics. So when we think of autologous cell therapy, let's take the CAR just because everyone's more comfortable with it, but this is definitely true for the Vericel products. You have collection at the patient and the whole manufacturing process and delivery back. Two questions about the patient proximal aspects. One, the 475, you encompass those, or are those separately billed? And two, how much control do you have over each of those elements from sort of an SOP to make sure that your product is being collected appropriately and then delivered appropriately?
So I guess the question is for me.
It is.
What I can say is the following. The 475, as we say, is the cost, the listed cost of the therapy. The therapy, in a way, is being defined, starts at the apheresis. Because that's where you collect the cells, you're already starting to make the therapy. But the cells are collected by the center. And then sent to us, deep frozen, sent to us, and then we transform the cells. Again, we cryopreserve, send back to the center, they infuse the cells. So that's what it's
So the
being about.
apheresis is not billed separately. It's all encompassing.
Yes, that's right.
And do you have SOPs? And you say you need to use this device, the Gambro device, using this SOP. How much do you control the collection as well?
I cannot comment too much on that. That's proprietary. But I can say that this is a unique situation where the apheresis is part of the process. Hence, we have specific agreement with the centers regarding that part of the process because there is an overall quality and liability responsibility around the process there.
Understood. Thanks.
And I'll just answer from a different perspective. So we actually make biopsy kits for both products that we send out to the centers who would like to take biopsies and then send them back to us. So it's administered as a kit, and like everything else, GMP, process controlled, et cetera. So.
And you have surgical procedures on both ends. That also your product pricing. You don't have separate pricing or separate billing for those two procedures. It's all encompassing.
In some cases we sell the biopsy kits, but when surgeons take a biopsy,
they
have
do
a
their own
CPT code.
CPT code. Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Next question. Next question. This is a prime opportunity, guys. Everyone's had their coffee this morning. There's a question over here.
All right. Hi. This may be, I don't know if this is within the realm of possibility, but you talked about outcomes-based pricing, value-based pricing, pay for performance. With the novel and innovative therapies that you have in place and are working towards with just a few years of data under you, and if you're looking at following patients and through a registry and collecting that longitudinal data. Do you think that there are going to be any implications from a payer CMS perspective? Because if you look at what CMS has done with hospitals and performance, pay for performance and readmission rates, say, for example, if there was a recurrence, many years later, an episode of that same disease state, do you anticipate any sort of clawback from a payer perspective?
As I said, I think the idea is that you have to align and define the outcome you are committed to. And it all depends on the outcome. If at this stage we have what we have in our clinical database, which is a very high level of complete response at 3 months, and most of them, 96%, are already there at day 31. That's only not PI. So that's what we have in terms of data. As you say, data will evolve with real-world evidence and what's happening there, as well as the long-term follow-up of this patient in the Eliana study, like in any other studies. So there might be, down the line, some other discussion about what's the outcome in 2 or 3 years or 10 years' time once we have better data set. But today is about what we have and what is already something amazing, which is that these kids that usually will survive only 3 to 9 months, and now 80% of them are surviving more than a year. So data will progressively mature, and there will be probably different discussions, but today is about what we have, which is already exceptional in terms of response rate and what it means for these kids.
Well, one thing I would add, it will be interesting. Certainly Novartis is in a position where they can say, or you can say, we'll wait 30 days, we'll wait 60 days, we'll wait 90 days if that becomes a paradigm, and then we'll bill for the product. Speaking from an emerging company perspective, that's a serious issue for companies that are emerging and don't have sort of a Novartis business to be able to sort of absorb that kind of cash flow timing and things like that. So that will be an interesting challenge for companies who are trying to do this on their own.
Yeah, you're right, but I think, to my knowledge, the 2 other gene therapies that have been approved in the world commercially, Kymriah and Strimvelis, have not been commercial success at all. And we have to invent something else.
Oh, yeah, no, I'm not saying it's not the
right model. Because to put 1 million mark or 750, we all do respect for the companies, and not to sell any, or to sell 0 for Kymriah and a few for Strimvelis, is not what your investors and others want to see as well. So we have to find a solution. It's very complex, it's very challenging, but as you say, Jeff, I mean, we have great data, and everybody wants to see this data being implemented in real life and curing disease or saving lives or doing something good for the patients. So we have to find a way to discuss and find solutions there. But just to put a price and that's it is not a solution.
Yeah, and each indication, as we've been talking about, is very unique. Each payer may be unique, or at least each country for sure, but then the payers may be unique themselves. I know that's not new that you negotiate with payers individually, but here it's pronounced, I think, even more pronounced. And I also think there are different ways for different payers and for different indications and for different geographies, whether it be a rebate-based approach versus a partial payment up front and payment over time versus a true pay for performance where you only get paid when they succeed. So I think there's a lot of flexibility and room to find the right solution for the right product in the right geography.
And just to add to that, we're talking about relapse refractory patients. As these products evolve and you move up line, and if you can give a one-shot and cure a large percentage of these patients, think about the downstream healthcare costs that are being saved. So again, I think we're at very early days here and still a lot of game to be played.
Thank you. Got right here.
Thanks so much. Yeah, Edworth Mysterious. So Pascal, I'm curious, you mentioned, I believe, that it was only 5 years from Novartis beginning to work with UPenn to approval, and I was wondering if you could comment on some of the core factors that made such a rapid timeline achievable, because I think that's an important issue for many of us in the field still at earlier stages.
Yeah. I think the first results that were achieved by UPenn with their own academic setting and from manufacturing to infusions there were really exceptional, so that created a very high bar in terms of what you want to achieve there. And the ability to move from that first patient immediately being treated in CHOP to now hundreds of patients being treated in just 5 years has been a lot around, and there was a comment on big pharma not being very agile, and that's true. So you have to find ways to become agile one way or the other. So we've been through different time within Novartis where we had initially just an integration of the technology, then we created this cell and gene therapy unit and the others that was like a small biotech within Novartis to be able to push that forwards. Then at the time, it was the right time to integrate that back into the full Novartis organizations to make sure that we can deliver globally that therapy to many patients. So there have been different phases there. And I think, what we've been able to show is that we've been agile enough to adapt to the different phase and to be successful there. But it's been a challenge. And I would like to thank all the people that have worked there, both within Novartis and also outside of Novartis, our partners, as well as the scientists at UPenn and elsewhere, because this has been, again, a partnership to achieve great results in a very short period of time.
Sorry, I'm not seeing. Over here would be great.
Something on the left side.
Well, that was a Hail Mary. I'm a cyclist. I don't catch things. I run. So a different perspective, I think Bob mentioned it, and that is competition and the center of excellence centered model about distributing these. Those very same center of excellences are very likely to be the centers who are both developing their own technologies, looking at, alternative, for example, CARs, developing their own CAR T cells, working with almost everybody on the planet who are developing CAR T cells. And while you have agreements in place with the institution, those aren't necessarily really going to dictate what a particular clinician is going to do with the therapy that he uses. Do you see this sort of potential risk to how the product's used, outcomes, et cetera, and the competition within these very same centers of excellence to be a unusual risk for developing a therapy at all? It's not the same thing as a small molecule, et cetera. It's going to be a very potentially challenging issue to make sure that clinicians use the product the way you want it to be used and actually use your product when there's new, cool follow-on products being developed all over the place, and again, including at these various centers of excellence.
Maybe I'll start, but I think all of my colleagues here will have their own views there. I think I don't see that as a particular challenge. I see that as an opportunity, or we see that as an opportunity, because there are some aspects where you achieve such a level of response and with an acceptable safety where there is limited room for adding medical value. So I don't see the centers trying to work on new ways to improve that. Whereas other disease, other indications, and lymphoma is a good case where we've achieved great results already and different companies working on that, but not yet at the level of what we have in PDLL. So there is room for improvement, and many centers, hopefully, will work on doing their own construct, their own ideas to be able to find ways, or their own combinations type of strategy to find ways to improve the clinical results. Once a product is approved, though, in most countries, this creates a specific barrier if you don't have a very good case for medical improvement there. Because you need to do a clinical study and you will need to get through the ethical committee approval. So you need to prove why do you want to take a risk on this particular patient when there is an approved therapy that has already achieving a very, very high level of response with acceptable safety. So depending on the indication, there will be different situations, but I believe it's an opportunity that the centers should continue to work on many, many new ideas there. I don't know whether you...
Yeah, I think, when you're thinking about the centers of excellence and the great scientific work that they're doing, in their particular center, the ability to scale those and meet the demand and the need that's just in those particular centers, I think, and from an FDA perspective, I don't see the academic centers being a competitor to FDA-approved products. I think, as Pascal said, they'll be working on the next generation of products that they'll probably partner with a large company to help them commercialize it if the data is compelling.
Yeah, I would say it's an interesting question, first and foremost. I'm sure we all discuss as it relates to the number of patients in the respective indications. I think this is to be proven, but there may be slightly different first mover advantage in this field than in other fields. And potentially create a higher bar for follow-on therapies because of the operational tentacles that you'll have into an organization in your specific way of treating the patients. How much and how quickly we ended up kind of coming together and standardizing the approach to these therapies, that's to be seen. And the faster that happens, I think the less there's a first mover advantage. But in the early days, there may very well be, because of the relationships you build with those institutions are new and new to them. So layering on another one is not going to be simple. I don't know, I think I'd be curious to hear on the panel whether you guys agree with that or don't agree with that.
I think at the end of the day, if you go back and you look at least in the oncology setting, the best-in-class products usually win. So if you're first and best, you are in great shape. And I think as these products evolve, it'll be different. And then I think the other element is, can any company scale at such a rate to meet the great demand for these products that I think these markets are going to be large enough for more than one player to play in and for all of us to do well. And I think they're going to need the capacity of each one of us to meet the demand out there for patients.
Okay, I think we're at the end of our time. I want to thank each of our panelists for taking time out of their very busy schedules to be here today. Very much.